Hello, welcome to another episode of Travelogue here on Sparks 1524. I'm Nathaniel Miller. You don't have to go 100 miles to have a day trip adventure. You don't have to necessarily leave your hometown. Now, granted, not every place has spectacular waterfalls and towering mountains. Not every place has thousand-year-old castles or whatever. But there's something to find everywhere humans live. One of the great things here in the Pensacola area is, of course, the Naval Air Station and our beaches, but we have some other very unique history, one of which is Fort Pickens. Now, today, Fort Pickens, which is located on the western tip of Santa Rosa Island, is part of the National Park Service. It belongs to, I guess is the best way to put it, the Gulf Islands National Seashore. However, back in 1834, Fort Pickens began life as one of the state-of-the-art fortifications developed after the United States, after we got our clocks cleaned in the War of 1812. It was very clear that while our Navy could hold the British Navy at bay, which it did, our coastline was hilariously undefended. The British literally walked all over us. They burned Washington, D.C. So Fort Pickens was built along with a system of fortifications around the country to fight off these threats. Now, warfare hadn't changed much from about 16th century to the middle of the 19th. Wooden ships with sails, cannons pulled by horses, smoothbore cannons. A masonry and earthwork fort would easily withstand the firepower of those kind of weapons. Mounting large caliber guns, all smoothbore, it could easily engage a ship out at sea. But even as Fort Pickens was commissioned in 1834, events were already moving that would render it obsolete before the end of the 19th century. Now, when the Civil War happened, Fort Pickens was one of only 4 Union forts in the South that were never taken by the Confederates. Pickens' advantage was the fact that it is at the end of a narrow barrier island. So the Union forces, as the secession crisis grew, the Union forces evacuated Fort Barrancas, which was the main fort, and it's on the mainland in the modern Naval Air Station. They evacuated that and came out to Fort Pickens. That's just what Robert Anderson did at Fort Sumter in South Carolina. He left a shore-based fort, went out to Fort Sumter, which was built on an island. Unfortunately, as we know history, the Confederates fired on that fort, beat it into submission, and the Civil War started. Well, the Confederates tried to take Fort Pickens several times, and they never could. They couldn't take it by sea, and because the island is so narrow, they couldn't take it by land. They ran into the very fortifications. It was, the dry moat, the walls, everything that the fort was built to use to repel a foreign invader. Well, now we're repelling rebels. Fort Pickens' most tragic and shameful moment came, though, during the Indian Wars later in the 19th century, when it was used as a prison for a number of warriors and peoples from the West. Most famously is Geronimo, the great Apache leader, was held at Fort Pickens for almost a year. It's definitely one of the fort's darker moments. Unfortunately, it is part of the story. Now, Fort Pickens would go on, however, to continue serving. By the late 19th century, like I said, Fort Pickens was already obsolete. Rifled shells, a lot of things that we had actually developed during our Civil War made our own weapons, our own forts obsolete. Rifled shells could punch right through a masonry fort, much less be fired from a ship so far away that they could hit the fort without the fort ever seeing you're firing on the ship. So all these masonry forts were suddenly obsolete and useless. Or were they? Secretary of War William Endicott had a brilliant idea. These are forts. We already have the land. The fort itself is, in essence, a development, a foundation that can be built upon. So the Endicott system of coastal artillery was built. Most of these were built with reinforced concrete structures, which had already been discovered to withstand the new high-powered, high-caliber naval artillery. This enabled Fort Pickens and its batteries to serve through World War I and World War II. A fort built in 1834 to counter threats that existed since the 16th century is now in the middle of the 20th century fighting a mechanized war against weapons that were never even imagined when it was built. But because it had evolved, it was still here. U-boats were a real concern early in the war, even here in the Gulf of Mexico. There were not any sinkings right up here in Pensacola, right where I am, but east coast of Florida, people in Jacksonville saw ships burning and sinking off their coasts. U-boat was a real threat. It came pretty close to derailing our merchant marine, not just the British, not just our allies. So enabling places like Fort Pickens to evolve to protect Pensacola Bay from the U-boat threat especially was huge. Now, whether Fort Pickens and Santa Rosa Island was so fortified that the Germans were afraid of it, or whether the winds of war just blew them somewhere else, we'll never know. Today, Fort Pickens is part of Gulf Islands National Seashore. It is an amazing place to walk through, both because of the great history that's there. And when I say great, I'm not about everything being good. Obviously, there were some dark times. I'm talking about great is an amazing set of stories at Fort Pickens. Tragic and triumphant. Being able to see the evolution of technology. When you stand on the parapet and you're looking out over Battery Pensacola, which is a Endicott system battery built in the middle of the parade ground right at the beginning of the 20th century, you are looking at a fort that was built with essentially technology that hasn't changed much since the 16th century. And you scan through that to Battery Pensacola to see where in the 20th century weaponry went. You get that whole vista in one view. Now, the fort, again, only was built in 1834, but that military technology hadn't evolved much for almost 300 years. And then from the middle of the 19th century through the 20th, look at the evolution of technology, and you can see that in one sweeping view on Fort Pickens. It's pretty cool. As you approach Fort Pickens for your visit, the first thing you're going to notice is that there's a huge gap in the fort's wall. The entire northwest corner of Fort Pickens is missing. This is where Bastion D used to be. June 20th, 1899, a fire broke out near Bastion D's gunpowder magazine, ignited 8,000 pounds of gunpowder, and effectively vaporized Bastion D. The explosion was so powerful it actually flung debris clear across Pensacola Bay into the city. Now, most of the fort's personnel had been evacuated from the area when it became clear that the fire could not be contained, but sadly, one soldier, Private Earl Wells, was killed, and a Private Henry Hopgood was injured during the blast. The Army never rebuilt the wall because it effectively gave them an easier, wider gate into the fort as the new batteries were being built and utilized. Now, this is Florida, especially in the summertime. Sunshine is one of our assets, but it will burn the crap out of you. Wear sunscreen. The endless days of summer are one of our tourist draws. It's also hot as crap. Drink a lot of water. Be aware of dehydration. Also, Gulf Islands National Seashore is a national park preserving pristine seashore. Wild animals are abundant in the area where Fort Pickens is now. Now, the Park Service maintains the fort and the grounds, but you're still part of a national seashore. Be aware of animals, snakes, alligators. You're not going to see them much in the fort, but you might see them out when you're hiking around the dunes and on the trails. And by the way, don't walk on the dunes themselves unless there is a designated hiking trail on the dunes. Thank you very much. So be aware of it. If you need to cool down, the fort's bookstore has a great air conditioner, obviously. It's a good place, but the fort itself is a masonry fort. Although the humidity is going to be just as high as everywhere else, you get in the depths of the fort, the temperature is much lower, so it's an easy way to cool down if you feel yourself overheating. You don't have to go miles and states away for an adventure. Sometimes you just need to go into your own backyard and see what's around. May not be terribly exciting. Maybe it is terribly exciting, but the only way to find out is to go explore. So sometimes your travel log can be done right in your own hometown. Well, anyway, those were my thoughts. That was a little look at the story of Fort Pickens. If you have any, if you'd like to read more about this, my written column is on my blog, www.sparks1524.com. It's also linked below in the description. I have also linked below Fort Pickens' website with the National Park Service down below. If you're planning a visit, check it out. They've got a lot of great resources, and there's a lot of fun stuff to do in the area. And remember, Gulf Islands National Seashore is not just the western end of Santa Rosa Island. It encompasses numerous sites along the northwest Gulf Coast here. So leave a comment if you like, either on my written blog or here. Love to hear from you. Please like this video. Please hit the little subscribe button if you're interested in my ongoing programming. And finally, feel free to share this with anybody you think would be interested in it. I hope you have a great day. I hope you go explore some great places. And until we meet again here on Sparks 1524, always go and do great things.